It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bob Woodward. Bob.
Thank you very much. It's terrific to be in this, one of the great valleys of Ohio and America. We're supposed to spend an hour together. What I'm going to do is try to talk for only a half hour or even less. You'll be blessed if it's the less. And then answer your questions as long as you would like. It was 8 years ago. I was at a conference in Colorado, and at one of the dinners, I wound up being seated next to Al Gore, the former vice president. Now, sitting next to Al Gore at dinner, to be honest, is taxing. To be really honest, it's unpleasant. Whether you agree with him or disagree with him, he is a hammer. And if you look at his biography, before he went into politics, he was a journalist and practiced journalism, and it turns out he thinks he invented that also. So he's hammering on me quite hard. I'd written 2 of the 4 books I'd done on Bush, and he said, "Why don't you come out against Bush in the Iraq War?" And I said, "No, I'm just trying to find out what happened." And he said, "No, wait a minute. When you and Carl Bernstein were working on Watergate, you came out against Nixon and the crimes of Watergate." And I said, "No, actually, we tried to be as factual and as empirical as possible." And in Gore's gentle way, he said, "Look, Buster, I read those articles." I said, "I wrote those articles." Didn't move the needle of self-doubt one bit. So then we got to the question, which is at the key of what I try to do as a reporter and author, and what all of you in one way or another do as citizens. How much do we know about what goes on? And particularly in the White House. So I asked Gore, you were there in the Clinton years for 8 years as vice president. I had a key office in the West Wing. Now, there was clearly 24/7 coverage of Clinton, many books. I'd written books on Clinton, dozens, really 100 books on Clinton at that point had been written. The 2 investigations, Whitewater and Monica Lewinsky. So I said, but now, 5 years after you guys left office, what percentage of what went on that's of interest or consequence do we now know? And he said, 1%. And I almost died. And I have to confess to having had an unclean thought. It happens. You can't control the inner life sometimes. So when he said 1%, I thought, is it possible there are that many women we don't know about? Didn't say that to him, and just said, if you wrote a tell-all autobiography, then what percentage of what went on of significance or interest would we know? And he said he'd never write such a book. And I said, hypothetically, if you did, what would be the percentage? And he said, 2%. Now, he's just being ornery. I think we know 60 to 70% of what goes on. But I tell you, I get up every morning haunted by what don't we know? What didn't make it out? What don't we understand? And the only way to deal with this is to develop a method. And I have the luxury of time, so for my projects for the Post or for books, I can go about systematically the last book, The Price of Politics, about Obama and the Republicans and Democrats on the Hill negotiating on spending and taxing and all of the stuff you've been reading about for the years of the Obama administration. I was able to interview people, get contemporaneous notes, memos, exchanges of offers, how to solve the problem between the Congress and the White House, go back and interview people, go back and back, try to develop a chronology, for instance, and then after doing this work for a little over a year, I sent President Obama a memo and said, I want to talk about these things, these decisions that you made, why you made them, why you said what I understand, your reactions and your words. And so I was able to interview him for an hour and a half and step through exactly what happened. And the reality is, there's so many things that just do not make it in the news, and I want to take one example from the book, and it's only one. In 2011, when they were negotiating the White House and the Congress on the debt ceiling, in other words, the president had to get authorization from Congress to borrow another $2 trillion to pay for just the matters that they had agreed on up to that point. And if he didn't get that money, we would default on our debt, and we would have a real serious financial crisis. Tim Geithner, then the Treasury Secretary, is running around telling the president, if we do not solve this problem, our actions and a default would trigger something worse than the 1930s recession. It would be indelible, it would last for generations, throw the whole global and U.S. economy out of alignment and off the rails. So this is a really serious moment, a genuine crisis. When I talked to the president, he said these 3 weeks in July of 2011 were the most tense of his presidency, more so even than going after Osama bin Laden. So what happened is the negotiations had collapsed on July 23rd. Speaker Boehner, the Republican, was trying to work out a deal, not just with his Republican counterpart, the minority leader, Senator McConnell, but with the Democrats, Harry Reid, the majority leader in the Senate, and Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader, minority leader in the House, and was getting kind of close to doing this. So the president called a meeting at the White House on that Saturday morning at 11 a.m. They all showed up, and he starts asking the congressional leaders, what's going on? And Harry Reid then says to the president, well, we're trying to work this out. Would you please leave? Now, I've covered presidents for 40 years. I've never heard, when I asked President Obama about this, I said, how did you feel about being voted off the island in your own house? And he said, I wasn't going to stand on protocol, so he left. They're trying to work this out. That night, President Obama called Speaker Boehner, and really, according to Boehner, the president was furious and whining and moaning and groaning and threatening about this because he was going to be cut out of the deal. So the next day, Sunday at 6 o'clock, the president calls just the Democrats, Reid and Pelosi, to the Oval Office in the White House. I suspect maybe wanted to do this in the Oval Office, figuring no one could ask him to leave that meeting. And the President says to Harry Reid, what's going on? What are you guys trying to work out here without me? And Harry Reid says, well, and then he says, oh, I'm not much into detail. Truer words were never spoken, by the way. He brought his chief of staff, David Crone, to the meeting. He said, David's going to tell you what's going on. So Crone outlines the plan, and then, in one of the most extraordinary moments in Oval Office history, Crone says to President Obama, Mr. President, I'm disappointed in the White House. I am disappointed in you for not having a fallback plan. You learn in private industry you always need a fallback plan. And Crone is quite exercised in a way, chewing out the president and almost yelling at him in the Oval Office. After the meeting's over, Obama makes a beeline for David Crone, and people step back saying, finally there's going to be a fist fight in the Oval Office. And what does Obama do? He puts his arm around David Crone. And this is the paradox of Barack Obama that all of us who try to understand him struggle with, and citizens, because at this moment, instead of being mad, he says to Crone, I understand how hard you're working on this. I realize how important it is. We're all trying to work together. We need to work together on this. Then what happens is Reid and Crone leave together in the same car. And Harry Reid says to his chief of staff, well, you stood up to him, to the president. He needed to hear it. No one was telling him. Now think about this. Pull back for a moment. This isn't a war between the Democrats and Republicans just. It is a civil war within the Democratic Party, as it definitely is in the Republican Party. Obama and Reid are the leaders of the Democratic Party in Washington and in the country as much as anyone. For Reid to communicate a message to the president that you've screwed this up, he has to bring his chief of staff to the Oval Office to virtually chew out the president to get the message through. There's no communication. People do not understand. People are not working together as they really should. Now, the larger question is for people trying to understand Washington and politics and what's going on now. What's going on now is really important. We have not an economic crisis, we have an economic opportunity. If the Democrats and the Republicans could work together, we would get this solved. But instead, there's a kind of hyper-partisanship where the White House and the Republicans bend truth, often without thinking about what they're doing. It's intuitive and instinctive because they know if they say something, both sides, their version will be accepted and promoted by their supporters almost blindly and will be eagerly embraced. So we have a political situation where people can literally almost say anything. Now, how do you filter out? How do you get at what's really happening? What are we up against here? And I remember this was a number of years ago. My wife and I were at a conference or attending a panel on aging. Anyone here interested in aging? Even the young are interested in aging. So it was a captive audience, and they had academics and physicians and psychologists, and James Watson, the co-discoverer of DNA, was on the panel. And Nobel Prize winner, and everyone's talking, and Watson says nothing for an hour. Finally, the moderator says, Dr. Watson, what do you think about aging? What do you have to say about aging? And he kind of woke up, leaned into the microphone and said, there's only one way to deal with aging. Stay away from old people. He nailed it. My wife and I were sitting behind Dr. Henry Kissinger, who was in the audience, Kissinger being the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State for Nixon and President Ford. And what they did after the panel, they handed out these little sheets in which you would self-score your lifestyle, answer a series of questions. Do you eat red meat? What is your general health? How much do you weigh? And so forth. And I wish I had one of these sheets because they're very comprehensive, and you would get points or not get points and then add it up, and it would tell you how many years you had to live. How many people interested in how many years they have to live? So Kissinger's filling this out with an intensity as if it was the 4th volume of his memoirs. And Elsa and I kind of, boy, Henry's really buzzed up here. So we availed ourselves of the Reporters' Freedom of Information Act and looked over his shoulder. In journalism, it's called direct observation. And he scored it all, and turned out he died 4 years ago. I've seen this man really unhappy, but never as unhappy as he was that day. So he kind of looks around the room, gets out his eraser, opens shuttle diplomacy with the questions. When's the last time he ate red meat? Oh, 1949. How many times do you exercise a day? 7 or 8, or maybe that was a week. Went through and rescored the whole sheet, added it all up. Turned out he had 10 years to live. And he looked around like, that's reality. Kissinger's the master of this, but he has no monopoly on rescoring. And that's what happens all the time, particularly in Washington politics. Something occurs, and it's called a spin, it's a deception, it's a, that's why tweeting is dangerous, because you only have 140 characters, and people can, say anything in 140 characters. And we have a rescored reality, and time again, it's in the news in a way that we're supposed to think, that's exactly what happened, when in fact it is not what happened at all. Now I want to spend a moment talking about, I've spent a good deal of time trying to understand President Obama and figure out what's at the core. Who is he? He's a complex political figure. There's a cartoon version of him that's out, which is not correct. There is a version that he is the one who has come to save us on everything, and he knows exactly what he's doing. That obviously is not correct either. And in doing these books, you're excavating. You're trying to get down to what really is there. And I want to take a couple of examples. The first book I did was Obama's Wars, on his decisions in Afghanistan. And when he literally added 30,000 troops to that war, and I again, had the luxury of time, getting the notes, interviewing everyone, re-interviewing, interviewing the president, going through the intelligence, and really laying out as best as somebody on the outside can lay out what happened. But the larger question is, what is Obama's view of war? How does he look at it? Is he willing to use it as a last resort instrument of foreign policy? Yes, I think he is. But as I've traveled this road, he does not like war. And at the end of Obama's wars, I printed a secret document about the agreement he made with the State Department, the intelligence community, and the military. It's clear. When that book came out in 2010, we're getting out of Afghanistan. As you know, if you followed this, we are getting out of Afghanistan. But again, what's at the center of who he is? So after I interviewed him, we got stepped through questions. This happened, this date, this intelligence report. We're walking out of the Oval Office, and he said laughingly, have you ever thought about becoming CIA director? I laughed, realizing it was everything but a job offer. It was not. But I hadn't got to that question of how does he really view war. And I brought along a quotation that I had typed out from one of the great World War II books written by a former colleague of mine at the Washington Post, Rick Atkinson. It's a book called Day of Battle. And in the book, Atkinson, immersed in the details of the war, but steps back and says the following about war. For war is not just a military campaign, but also a parable. There are lessons of camaraderie and duty and inscrutable fate. And I've handed this to the president, and he's reading it. But then Atkinson writes, war is corrupting, corrupts everyone, from the private to the general to the commander-in-chief, essentially because it is the business of killing other human beings. War corrodes the soul and tarnishes the spirit. And even the excellent and the superior can be defiled. And in war, no heart would remain unstained. I'm reading this, and he says quickly, I sympathize with this view. And he said, go look at my Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Now, I'd heard it, I had read it, but I went home and dug it out, and in Oslo City Hall, at the end of 2009, when he received that award, he said the following: the instruments of war do have a role to play in preserving the peace, yet war is never glorious. If you may recall, Churchill said war is glorious. Obama said war is never glorious, and we must never trumpet it as such. That war is sometimes necessary, but always on some level, war is a manifestation and expression of human folly. My view is getting out of Afghanistan he's not a peacenik, and he understands the truth in the notion that he who desires peace must prepare for war, but he, at the inner Obama, does not like war and wants to get out. Now then, there is this other thing in his second inaugural, just a couple of months ago, and it just shot by. It was a sentence that when I watched it, I said, is this in the inaugural address of a president? It was, and it is one of the most revealing sentences ever uttered by a president, or particularly by Barack Obama. He's talking about the middle class and his aspirations for a second term, and then he says the following, quote, "We are true to our creed when a little girl born in the bleakest poverty knows that she has the same chance to succeed as anybody else." Now think about that for a moment. A little girl born in the bleakest of poverty, not in our lifetime, not in the lifetimes of our great-grandchildren are we going to get to a point where that little girl born in the bleakest poverty is going to have the same chance as anybody else. But on an aspirational level, that's what Obama thinks. That's the goal. That's what he believes. And that's what, in his own way, he is shooting for. The last point I wanted, next to last point I wanted to make is how has politics changed or not, going back to Watergate in the Nixon era? And some of you may remember this. The day Nixon resigned, August 9th, 1974, the night before he'd gone on television and said he was going to resign the next day. And then the next day, he called all of his top aides, cabinet, and friends to the East Room of the White House and gave a speech that was televised on national television live. It was Nixon raw. There was no text. He was sweating. He was understandably overwrought. He was going to have to give up the presidency, which he had worked all of his life to get to. And he talked about his mother. He said his mother was a saint. He talked about his father. He read from Teddy Roosevelt's diary, in which Roosevelt said that when his wife died, the light had gone out of his own life forever, almost comparing the loss of the presidency with that. Aides of his in the audience were worried that this would be the first time somebody actually went bonkers on live national television. I mean, go back and look at it. Most amazing performance. But then again, this is the paradox of Nixon, and there is always a paradox in everyone, and indeed presidents. He waved his hand at like kind of, "This is why I called you here." And he said the following, "Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself." Now think of the wisdom at that moment. He identified it. He realized that it was hate. Hate was the piston in his presidency. Listen to those tapes, and it is just so much hate. Let's use all the mechanisms of the federal government to get our enemies. The sadness of Nixon is not just the crimes, the abuse of power. If you listen to enough of those tapes, as I have, there's a dog that doesn't bark. And no one ever says, what does the country need? What would be good for the country? It was always about Nixon using this power as an instrument of personal revenge. And so the real tragedy of Nixon is the smallness. Did not understand the great things that presidents can do and the incredible power. I think it's even increasing today. I think Clinton had more power than Reagan, and I think Bush had more power than Clinton, and I think that Obama actually has more power than George W. Bush. Incredible concentration of power in the presidency. And so at this moment, Nixon realized that it was hate. And if you go look at the other presidents, as I have tried, there are lots of flaws, lots of problems, lots of mistakes, but it's not hate. There is not that venom that was in the Nixon presidency, in all of these presidencies, whether you, after Nixon, certainly not Ford, certainly not Carter, certainly not Reagan, certainly not Bush Sr., certainly not Clinton. His problem was love. Certainly not George W. Bush, and certainly not Obama. So the question becomes, as you sift through all of the international issues and the economic issues, domestic issues, leadership issues, what should we worry about? If we got a blackboard here and we said, okay, everyone name what they worry about most outside of their personal and family life, we would, certainly wars, certainly climate change, certainly healthcare, certainly the economy. I asked the president of this university tonight at dinner, what's on the minds of the students? And she said, jobs. And that is true. That is a problem. The problems are endless. But if I were to try to answer that question, what should we worry about most? My answer would be we should worry the most about secret government. That's what Nixon tried. That's what many presidents have tried, and the judge who said it got it right. Democracies, precious as they are, can die in darkness. And I think that's absolutely true. When I had finished one of my books, the head of Simon & Schuster, which has published them all, took me to dinner in New York. And I thought, oh, this is great. The boss wants to have dinner. And so we sat down, and he said, okay, what's your next book? And I said, well, I want to do some reading and thinking and reporting. And he said, what? Why are you going to waste your time? And I said, well, come on, now that's what we try to do. And he said, no, you are one of our authors. We need to know your next book right away. We are in the marketing business. We are in the product delivery business. What's it going to be? And I said, this is ridiculous that you want to have this. And he would not give up on it. We'd talk about something, he'd say, how about a book on that? And I'd say, no, that way. And then, he's one of these people who just grinds on you. You may know people like that. You may work for somebody like that. You may be married to somebody like that. Grind, whatever happens, whatever comes up, it's the subject that's on their mind. He would not let me up. And so I finally said, I figured out what my next book is going to be. He said, oh, good, at last, what? And I said, my next book will be an expose on the publishing business in New York City. And he said, oh, that's wonderful, that's terrific. And I even have a great title for you. He said, I don't think there are any great titles left. He said, there's one. I said, really? He said, yes, your expose on the publishing business in New York City will be called My Last Book.